So
Ready?
So we find ourselves.
We go to me. Split wings. Okay, now I'm all prettied up.
All prettied up. Nowhere to go.
Pretty.
Okay. So we find ourselves at another CQD spotlight.
Yeah, Code Question of the Day. Another episode of Code Question of the Day vlog podcast.
We got to come up with what that's really called.
Let's just call it a vlogcast.
A vlogcast. I like it.
The link right here.
Yeah. Yeah. So another broadcast, another day.
Another topic.
Another question. We've been digging into a lot of really good topics. And I'm sure just everybody who's watching this, you can comment on these. You can send questions in via Charlie Trout's Code Question of the Day website.
Yeah, absolutely. Once again, I'm Kyle Krieger, Executive Director of Codes and Standards with Mika.
Thomas Dimitrovich, Director of Codes and Standards for Eaton.
And all around nice guy.
Try, yeah.
And today's topic or question, Tom.
Oh boy.
Should be right up your alley. Because it's one that I know is near and dear to your heart as a code making panel 2 member.
Yes, it is.
So we received several Code Question of the Day submissions on this when the 2023 edition was published and 2023 edition of the NEC was published and training update courses started to go on. And it relates to island and peninsular receptacle requirements. And the question is, did the requirement for receptacles on peninsulas and islands in kitchens really go away for the 2023? And there's a lot of different ways to answer that and a lot of different opinions on this subject matter. But I guess in short, the answer would be yes, kind of.
Yeah. The requirement for it went away.
Yeah.
There's a permission. But you have to follow the rules.
With very stringent guardrails, right?
Yep.
You want to give us a little bit of background on what drove that change?
So 21052. So I came into Code Panel 2 during the 2017 cycle.
Okay.
And if you go back to the 2017 edition, 21052 gets a lot of comments, and it always has. And what I learned was that a lot of the debate was around the connecting edge. Okay, is it the wall? Is where the peninsula lands, and connects with the countertop? Is that the connecting edge? Is it the wall? And how do you measure it, right? So if you go back to the 2017 edition of the code and look at 210.52, and we'll focus in on because where all the debates are is countertops and work surfaces, right? And peninsulas and islands. Where's that? That is in 210.52. 210.52. I think it's C. Yep.
C2.
C2. Yep. So we had in the 17 code, it said you have to have at least one receptacle installed in each island countertop space with a long distance dimension of 24 inches or greater and a short dimension of 12 inches. So that sort of lays out the rectangle, right? Mm-hmm. And then in peninsulas, we said at least one receptacle outlet shall be installed at each peninsula countertop long dimension space with a long dimension of 24 inches or greater. Now, when you think about a peninsula and you think about, well, what do I mean by the long dimension? And there was an image in an IAEI presentation that showed a peninsula where both sides of the peninsula were the same length. And if you read this literally, that means you need one receptacle on each side because it says in each peninsula countertop long dimension space. So we had that, and then we had a bunch of public inputs for the 2020 code. When you look at the 2020 code, we took a different approach. We said And I remember these discussions. It's the same section, C2, island and peninsula countertops and work surfaces. Then we went to this. You had to do a calculation. You had to have one receptacle
Based
outlet.
on the size of
Yeah, you had to measure.
because let's be honest, right? The trend with peninsula, or not peninsulas, islands especially.
Yeah.
There were some kitchens being designed where the entire countertop space was just a giant island in the
Yeah,
middle of the
exactly.
kitchen. Some cases 6-8 feet long, and by the rule of the code, you only needed one receptacle on that giant island.
That's exactly right. So then we went to this calculation, 9 square foot, and then you had additional for 18 square foot and fractions thereof, and we had debates about fractions thereof and all that jazz. So that didn't go over so well. We had a lot of public comments on that.
See,
one.
and I actually liked that.
Did you?
Because it at least then it was, there was a requirement for the receptacles, and it was based on the size,
Yeah.
right, of the island, instead of this one on each side if you got a sink
Right.
separating it and all this stuff. A lot of this discussion, a lot of these requirements are all driven by the cord length on appliances, right?
Sure.
When you think
Yeah.
about it. And they
Yeah.
come with like what, a 3-foot cord or a 2-foot
24 inches, I
yeah,
guess.
24-inch 2-foot cord.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a
Yeah.
if you got an island that's 5 feet, 6 feet long, and
Sure.
you only have one receptacle, you're gonna have all your appliances jumbled around that one location.
Absolutely right. So what the problem with that language was, we didn't tell you where to put the receptacles. So I was down in Texas.
You could still put. You may be required to have 10 receptacles, but you could put them all in the same corner if you wanted to. Right?
And that's exactly what they were doing.
Yeah.
So I went down to Texas, walked into to a meeting, and there were a group of inspectors and some contractors, and they pulled me in there, and the inspector was showing me pictures, and the pictures were of the end of a peninsula or an island, and there was a multi-gang box, and so the inspector was like, well, it meets the language of the code because all these receptacles are right here. But what the inspector's issue was, the contractor used one box, which is one outlet for, 5 receptacles. And so the inspector was like, well, no, you need 5 individual boxes because it says you have to have one outlet per so many square feet.
Yeah.
And so the contractor, rightfully so, was saying, well, that's ridiculous.
That is ridiculous.
I mean, why would I have to go put 5 different little boxes right by each other when I could just get a 5-gang box and throw them in there? So they were going back and forth, and they were pointing out various issues with this. Well, at the same time of the public inputs, I was chairing a task group, and Doug Lee from the CPSC sent me a spreadsheet of.
Before we get into that,
Sure.
while we're talking about the 2017 and
and the 2020,
the 2020, before you get into the statistics related to the change in the 2023, one of the things that tends to happen in our code is we have charging text of a subdivision or a section, right, that says this is what the rule is.
Yeah.
In this case, we have 21052C5, which tells us the receptacle locations for countertops, right? C5, right?
Wait, which edition?
Well, the 2017. I'm still in the 2017.
You're in the 2017. Yeah.
So
Okay. Yep. C5. Yep.
Gives us the receptacle locations, and it says it's got to be located on or above, but not more than 20 inches above the work surface.
Yeah.
It could be a pop-up style. It's listed for a work surface or countertop. Yeah. And it goes on to give, the parameters of where it's got to be located.
Yep.
But then we have an exception.
Yes.
And as often happens, the exception becomes the rule, right? Because of convenience in construction or aesthetics or whatever it is.
Yeah.
But this exception to number 5, to comply with the following conditions, 1 and 2 receptacle outlets shall be permitted to be mounted not more than 300 millimeters, 12 inches below the countertop or work surface. Receptacles mounted below the countertop or work surface in accordance with this exception shall not be located where the countertop or work surface extends more than 6 inches beyond the support base. So 6-inch overhang. And then it's constructed for the physically impaired or on an island or peninsular work surface, is flat across its entire surface, no backsplashes, and there are no means to install a receptacle 20 inches above. So essentially it's given us this hierarchy, right?
Yeah.
You got to either put it above the work surface, not higher than 20 inches above. And if for whatever reason the construction of the island or the peninsula or the countertop, then you can apply this exception and put it below.
Correct.
I don't know about you, but every kitchen island I've ever seen, prior to the advent of the pop-up style receptacle,
Yeah.
the receptacle is always cut into the side of the cabinet.
Oh, absolutely.
Below the countertop.
Absolutely.
This is one of those exceptions that has by and large become the rule.
The rule.
For convenience, aesthetics, and what have you, right?
Yeah.
They get a receptacle that is a close match to the finish of the cabinet or complements the finish of the cabinet, and they cut it into the side. It's almost automatic. There's none of the other considerations are made. Said, hey, can I put it above? Can I put it, in a pop-up
And nobody
style?
wants to cut a nice granite piece of granite and put a plastic pop-up at it.
Especially an electrical contractor.
Oh my goodness, yes.
You come in after the fact, and now
you got imagine if you cracked it.
Yeah.
You just bought a very expensive countertop.
So here's a situation where really it starts with proper application of the rule. Right? If we could comply with the main rule, then we shouldn't even be going to the exception.
You're absolutely right.
But because the exception has become the rule, now we get into all these statistics from the Consumer Safety Product Commission.
You're absolutely right. And it went in the code in the 1990 edition.
Okay.
So because I on the task group, when Doug Lee sent the CPSC spreadsheet with all the instances of individuals, a lot of them were children, but they were not all kids, who pulled, like crock pots or deep fryers, all that, right? And didn't kill them, but scalded them for the rest of their life.
Imagine?
Oh man, I don't even want to think about it. It's terrible. So he gave all that data, and then there was a discussion at panel 2 on how do you address panel 2. Think about it. Panel 2 deals with ground fault circuit interrupters, arc fault circuit interrupters. And
so many safety related pieces, right?
Yeah, and based on data. So now we have data. So my question to Doug Lee to the CPSC was, when I did my homework, I said, okay, it went in 1990. His data started in 90s, late like 91, something like that. So I asked the CPSC can you go further back in time? Because if it was a problem before 1990, then you can't even associate it with the code.
So you're saying that the data that you guys were presented was post 1990.
Yes.
And how many incidents?
There was I don't even remember the number of incidents. There was a whole spreadsheet. It was
over 100.
Yeah, it was definitely over 100. Right? Easy. Yeah.
And if I'm not mistaken, the Consumer Safety Product Commission, right? That's
Consumer Product Safety Commission.
Consumer Product Safety Commission.
Yep.
They base their information on reports from
the public.
Yeah, but they use a sampling of hospitals that participate.
Oh yeah, you're right. It's not all hospitals.
So it's not all hospitals.
Oh, that's a good point.
It's a network of hospitals that specifically work with the commission and provide the reporting data.
That's right. That's exactly right.
So we're not even talking about any of the hospitals where they've seen incidents like this outside of that network.
You're right. And I asked them for the evidence before. They said they didn't have it. And then in that 90 edition, there was a public comment made by I can't remember his name, from IAEI. I have the actual public comment. I might throw up on the screen if I can. But he had made the statement that if we do this, we're probably going to start seeing people pulling things off of countertops. So that was another indicator in my mind that if it was a problem already, he wouldn't have said we're going to start seeing it, right? So, because in my mind, I'm trying to triangulate, make sure that are we saying cause and effect? Because that's what was going on. So the panel was presented with data, and then we had to make a decision how are we going to act on this data. And when it went in, so here's the other thing. When it went in the code, if you remember back in the day, I like saying back in the day, so it makes me sound old.
Yeah.
So when they put that in, it was during the process of the realization that appliances, remember, we didn't have rules in the kitchen for the number of receptacles and things. What was going on, and when you look at when they started to mandate an increased number of receptacles in general in the kitchen, was because you had coffee pots that had a clock that had to be plugged in. And the arguments were these appliances are built with clocks and things like that, and they're not unplugged, put away. They are left in. So now if you had two receptacles in your kitchen and you had the microwave and the coffee pot that both had clocks and timers, they're always going to be plugged in. Now you have no receptacle. So they increased the number of receptacles. And in that process, they added it to the peninsulas and islands. There wasn't a tripping issue. There wasn't like data of people, because that's the other argument I hear is, well, now we're going to use extension cords in kitchens and now we're causing a tripping issue. So in any case, so we had to do something about it. And the debates were, you had a group of people that said they want to mandate pop-ups, at least one pop-up. You had another group that said, we want to prohibit any receptacle. So you can't, even if you want to, you couldn't use the pop-up.
Right.
Okay. So you had both those dynamics, which was really interesting because you get to see the process at work and you get to see them argue and they go back and forth. And it was like watching the waves. The waves would go this way and then the waves would go that way. And eventually they settled on saying, let's make it optional. But if you do, then we're going to govern the rules on where you put the receptacle. It has to be on the top because they want to avoid the cords from hanging over the edge. So that's what they ended up with in the 2023 code.
So let's break down what the new rule actually, because it's that, but there's a little more to it, I think.
Oh yeah, there is, because if you don't put one there, then they want provisions so that if the homeowner wants to put a receptacle in that island or peninsula at a later date, they have power there to get it done.
So for a peninsula or island,
yep,
you cannot put it below the work surface anymore to serve the countertop.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I've heard multiple times now is, well, you can't put it below the countertop to serve the countertop.
Mm-hmm.
But if I want to put it below the countertop, say like my island, on the other side of the island is my living room.
And I want it for plugging in a vacuum
or to serve as a wall space, you can put it way below the island, right?
Sure.
Or does it even have to be way? So you can put one in that and say it's not serving the countertop.
So that's the...
Sounds like there's a gap that maybe needs to be closed there, eh?
Here's the issue. Look at where 21052 is. It's in part 3 of 210, which is titled Required Outlets.
Required Outlets.
So now if I say this isn't a required, I'm going above and beyond, Kyle. I'm out there for my customer and they want this receptacle. And I put it
because I wanted to.
I'm doing it because I wanted to. And I put it 4 inches from the top of the counter. And I say, that's not a required outlet. I'm putting it there. It's optional.
Auxiliary.
It's an auxiliary, right? It's my customer wants it there for some other reason to then to serve this. And it's not one of the, that's the problem with putting it in my opinion, and putting it in part 3.
Yeah,
so
almost has to be
in part 1. So I made a public input for part 1. Okay. And multiple people did, not just me.
So a public input
for the 2026 cycle. And they did not take it. What panel 2 did was they modified 21052 to say required and permitted, something like that. I think it's required and permitted receptacle outlets in, I'll tell you exactly what we ended up with, which I still have heartburn with. It says required and permitted receptacle outlets. Now, from a correlation perspective, If you have a part that only applies to required, how can you even say required and permitted receptacle outlets?
Oh, so you're saying that the correlated committee should have stepped in there and maybe.
Well, I no. I think that there's another opportunity yet to improve the language, because I here's what I think. I think there are some people that would like to have that receptacle there, and they may not understand the data that was presented and the challenge in that regard.
Potential danger that comes along with it.
Exactly. So we made some tweaks in the 2026 to try to address the gap. We got a little closer. Is it perfect? Probably not. And that's why the process is so important, so that when somebody sees this language and they're trying to implement it, if they have ideas on how to perfect it better, make another public input. And I'm still not done with trying to put a requirement in part 1. And the other concern that comes with this, and you read it in the 17, when you looked at that exception in the 2017 code, it said the exception was 1, construction for the physically impaired.
So lower countertops for the lower receptacles for ADA.
They're worried about the accessibility. So we have Dan Book on our panel, who represents the home builders. He says, wait a second, we can't prohibit these from below this, because what happens to the ADA and what happens to with regard to accessibility? The challenge we have there is we don't have all of the accessibility requirements and construction codes and standards is around commercial buildings. There's nothing that's out there for the residential dwelling unit, and putting and just addressing a receptacle in a kitchen. If I take my standard kitchen and I put a receptacle below and say, okay, that's there for ADA, well, and I don't even have enough room for a wheelchair to get in there, and I have no other accessibility. So Annex J was, I think, important, but we removed that, and there's a new ICC standard for ADA accessibility. And so what I like about this process is there are individuals that didn't like the change, and they brought up the accessibility. Those who said, well, we have to support the change because of all the statistics. And, oh, by the way, there's no real guidance on accessibility. And, oh, if you look at Annex J, which is annex material, it's written it says you shall, and you can't have shalls back there.
It annexes informational. Right?
Exactly. So it identified a problem, and then it spurred the creation of another document. I mean, to me, I mean, I love, it's one thing to say it's not just controversial. It's motivational to say there's an opportunity here to increase safety. So let's get these other holes plugged with other codes and standards and guidance for what do I do? Because accessibility, what about the panel board? If my panel board's in a basement and I have no wheelchair access to the basement, there are other areas. There's light switches. How far off the ground are they? There's so many other areas from an electrical perspective, opportunities for us to put in the National Electrical Code installation requirements specifically for when you're designing the entire structure for ADA. So I had the idea to create an article for it, and I took Annex J and I copied it over. I never made the public input. I wanted to get with Dan Book and everybody else, but there's a lot of codes and standards around accessibility. And I think the 2023 code and the 2026 is making some good steps to address the statistics and make kitchens and those areas safer. So I think we're going in the right direction. I think we've got some more guidance around ADA. And
so the rule itself, if we're going to install a receptacle, don't have to.
Oh, yeah, you don't have to. Yeah,
it's got to be above the countertop, right?
Yep, on or above, but not more than 20 inches above.
More than 20 inches.
Yep.
So you're either talking about in a backsplash, if there's a backsplash on like a breakfast bar style island where you have like your work surface or your countertop surface, and then there's a step up for a breakfast bar, and there may be like a backsplash
yeah,
there.
yeah,
They put
yeah.
it there.
Yeah, yeah.
Or a pop-up style, like countertop receptacle would be
Absolutely.
acceptable.
Yep.
Or you don't put one in at all, right?
Right.
If you can't accommodate those 3 criteria,
Yep.
then you don't put one in at all.
Right.
And if you don't put one in at all, you have to make future provisions.
Yeah.
Let's talk about that future provisions.
That language is generic enough that it's caused some debate in the industry.
Yeah, because so when I look at that, when I see you have to have future provisions if you don't put one in that complies. There's a couple of different ways. I guess this goes back to the get your AHJ involved, because if I'm out there as an installer or as an AHJ, it's kind of open ended.
Yeah.
So if I'm doing an inspection on a new home, brand new build.
Yep.
There's no island or peninsular receptacle, and the basement is wide open.
Yeah.
There's no finished basement. The ceiling in the basement is open, or
like in my house. My house, I have my peninsula is below the unfinished side of my basement. And if I wanted to add anything, my panel board's right there.
Yeah, you just run a separate 20. You'd have to
drill a hole up through the floor, and I'm there.
For an island receptacle, it would be code compliant. So, does that mean that the future provisions are already present and you would not have to, or was and now we're kind of speaking to the intent of the code making panel, right?
It's hard.
Was the idea that we want a 4-inch square junction box in the cabinet base, so all they have to do at any time, no matter what happens to the basement, is they can power up and supply.
I have heard debates on all sides of that. I've had some contractors tell me that, like in my scenario, the inspector required them to pull the wire to the box and terminate it in there with caps and say, okay, now you have met the requirement. As it says, provisions shall be provided. It says at the island or peninsula, and that's their argument. They're saying it says at the island or peninsula. So having the provisions like in my case, where I have the panel board right there and I have access, is that at or is right? So they'll use that to say, okay, you need to pull a wire and put a box there. And then even if you're below the floor and say, well, all you got to do is cut a hole and go up through it. No, that's not at the peninsula, because that's in the kitchen.
So this is one of those where you need to definitely touch base with the AHJ. And they may have closed that gap with a local ordinance or a state, requirement or modification as well, just so they don't have to deal with it, right?
Yep.
So always, again, good idea to touch base with your AHJ so you're not out there.
You don't want to have to go back out and say, I have to now drill a hole or I need to pull another wire. But, if, like in my case, in my basement, if somebody told the electrician, hey, I need a wire pulled right there,
not a big deal.
It's not a big deal. It's pain in the rear end, but it was really, then the discussion was not about that application. So the discussions we had at the code panel was when you build slab on grade.
So that's the one that you really don't have a choice then, right? Because you have to have that you're not easily adding anything to an
you're going to put a raceway. You're probably going to put a raceway into the concrete, and if you miss that one, now that's a big deal. So, but that is where we had the discussions. We weren't talking about, and that's the problem with some of this, is you have the discussion at the code panel, and you're so focused on those scenarios where you go, well, what about slab on grade, and what about a real tight crawl space, and things like that, where it's almost impossible. We don't have the discussions about, oh, this is if you have a basement with a panel board and it's all open, that's not what we talked about. We wrote the code around we wrote the language to address the more stringent application. But then when you go back and look at those others and you say, well, what's the intent here? What do you want me to do? And to your point, you got to have that agreement with your HJ.
Yeah.
Sit down, have the conversation, build the team.
Definitely a tricky one to navigate.
Yeah.
We'd love to hear some of the comments from you all and how you guys are navigating this. And those of you that have adopted the 2023 NEC, and are running into this with your HJ, definitely a topic that is worth discussing and probably will come up again at some point. I would imagine.
Absolutely. And then you wonder if they're on an earlier edition of the code, would somebody bring the 2023 code up and say, hey, do you really want to put this here?
Yeah, how do you address that? Something that's been proven to be such a safety issue.
And that's why code adoption is so critical.
Yeah.
And we have new technology hitting this next code cycle is going to have a new article for not electric vehicles, but for electrical self-propelled vehicles with like boats and tractors and all these other things. We talk about that in a separate section on 625, a 625 question. So when you have the code's trying to keep up with technology. And we have some states still in the 2008 National Electrical Code.
Yeah. Sometimes it's an insurmountable task, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes just the way that their cyclical code adoption is, it's hard, tough to do.
Tough to do. Look forward to your feedback. That's for sure, guys and gals out there watching.
All right. Well, I think that does it for another episode of the CQD Spotlight.
I love this program.
Yeah. Great discussion.
Cool beans.
We'll see you next time.
Same bat time, same bat channel. Right. I'm going to do two things. I'm worried about that.